The room was still laughing when I picked up my purse. 30 years of marriage. And my husband stood in front of 200 people and told them he wished he'd married someone else. Said my name, like it left a bad taste. Said, loser, like it was a punchline he'd been saving. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was watching my own children throw their heads back and laugh like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all year. My name is Janet Caro. I've been married to Osgood Bowles since I was 26 years old, and until that night, I thought I understood exactly what kind of man I married. I didn't stand up right away. I want you to understand that. I sat there for a moment, hands folded in my lap, and I let myself really look at him. Really look. The way you look at something you've been avoiding looking at directly for years. Because if I'm honest with you, that speech wasn't the first time. It was just the loudest. For years it had been small things. Introductions at dinner parties where I was Osgood's wife, and nothing more, like I hadn't built anything of my own. Conversations where I'd say something, and watch it land soft and forgettable, until he said the same thing 10 minutes later, and the table nodded like he'd discovered fire. I noticed. I always noticed. I just never said anything, because saying something out loud makes it real, and some of us spend years choosing not to make things real. Where are you joining me from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I always like knowing who's sitting with me when I tell these things. So when he stood at that podium, thanked every single person in that ballroom by name, and then looked right past me, past 30 years, past every sacrifice, every quiet accommodation, and said, Janet's a loser. I wish I'd married her best friend instead. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. Something in me just went very, very still. Because this wasn't new information, this was confirmation. Wendell Streeter was 2 tables over, and I saw his face change before I even reacted. That told me everything about how bad it looked from the outside. My daughter Odalis was laughing behind her champagne glass. My son Thaddeus didn't even try to hide it. That hurt worse than anything Osgood said. Children who watch a room mock their mother and decide to join in aren't confused. They're comfortable. And comfort like that doesn't happen overnight. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my dress. I didn't look at Osgood. I didn't look at my children. I walked past the gift table, past the banner that said, "Congratulations on your retirement." And I walked out of that ballroom without a single person stopping me, because laughter doesn't leave room for anyone to notice a woman leaving quietly. The drive home was silent. No tears, no shaking hands, just a clarity I hadn't let myself feel in years. I sat down at my kitchen table, still in my dress, and I picked up my phone. I didn't call a friend. I didn't call my sister. I called the one man who already knew exactly what to do the moment I gave the word. Cassius picked up on the second ring. "Janet," he said. "It's late." "Begin what we discussed," I said. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to hear him understand exactly what that meant. Cassius didn't ask me if I was sure. "That's the first thing you should know about the man who has handled my affairs for almost 15 years. He simply said, "Give me 2 hours," and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about my mother. She used to say it to me so often I stopped hearing it as advice and started hearing it as background noise, the way you stop hearing a clock ticking in a room you've lived in too long. "Never put a man's name on what I leave you, Janet. Not out of spite. Out of wisdom she'd earned the hard way, watching her own sister lose a house she'd inherited because she thought marriage meant merging everything, including the things that were never his to begin with. I listened to her. When she passed and left me that house on Delow Drive, and the little commercial building 2 blocks from it, I kept both deeds exactly as they came to me. Just my name. Osgood never asked why, not in the beginning. I think he assumed it was formality, the kind of thing that gets fixed eventually. It never needed fixing. It was already right. Years later, when I started the business, the event venue, the property management side that grew out of it, I built it the same way. Sole member. My signature on the formation documents filed with the Secretary of State the same spring I turned 41. Osgood came to work there not long after, and I gave him a title that meant something to say out loud at parties. Operations Manager. He ran the day-to-day beautifully, I'll give him that. He was good at people, good at problems, but his name was never on a single filing. Not because I was hiding something from him, because I already knew, somewhere quiet in me, that a marriage and an ownership structure are not the same promise. None of what happened next was improvised. Cassius had a locksmith he'd used for years, on call for exactly this kind of situation. The same way he kept a standing relationship with the security firm that handled the business's access systems. I'd set all of it up quietly, alongside the deeds and the formation documents, long before I ever needed to use it. Preparation isn't suspicion. It's just what happens when a woman has watched enough marriages end badly to know the difference between hoping for the best and planning for reality. By the time Cassius called back, it was almost midnight. "Locksmith's at the house now," he said. "Should be done in 20 minutes, and I've sent you the access panel for the business systems. You'll need to do that part yourself. Only your credentials clear that level." I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, still in the dress I wore to watch my husband humiliate me in front of 200 people, and I found the employee access list. Osgood Bowles, Operations Manager, Level 3 clearance. My hand didn't shake when I revoked it. There's a kind of quiet that comes after doing something you've quietly prepared for without ever admitting to yourself you were preparing. Not triumph. Something steadier than that. I didn't feel like a woman getting revenge. I felt like a woman finally exhaling after holding her breath for longer than she realized. Cassius texted me once more before I went up to bed. Done. Locks changed. Access closed on both ends. Get some rest, Janet. I didn't rest. Not really. I lay there in the dark, thinking about all the years I let people believe access was the same thing as ownership. Osgood believed it. My children believed it, in their own way, believing their father's comfort in that house meant something legally binding it never did. I wondered, lying there, how long it would take him to notice. Somewhere across town, I imagined him laughing with whoever was left at that party, riding the high of a room that had turned my humiliation into his entertainment, with absolutely no idea that the ground under his feet had already shifted. He'd find out soon enough. Everybody always does, eventually. The first call came in at 11:47 that night, while I was still lying in the dark trying to convince myself I'd sleep. I watched my phone light up the ceiling, and I didn't touch it. By the 5th call, I turned it face down. By the 20th, I stopped counting the buzzing and just listened to it, like weather passing through a house it couldn't get into. I didn't see any of what happened to him that night. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters. Everything I'm about to tell you, I only know because Odalis told me. Days later, her voice still unsteady with it. I'm telling it to you the way she told it to me. As she described it, he'd stayed at the party another hour after I left, riding the laughter, shaking hands, still glowing from a room that had turned my humiliation into his encore. She said he told her the key hadn't turned when he got home, that he tried it twice, jiggled the handle, walked around to the side door out of habit, and tried that too. Nothing. A house that used to open for him without question, sealed like it had never known his name. That's when the calls started. from what I understand. He must have assumed it was a mistake at first, O'Dallas thought. A stuck lock, a fluke, something a locksmith could undo by morning. It wasn't until he drove to the business, badge in hand out of muscle memory, that the second door failed him too, at least according to what he told her. 13 years of walking into that building, like he owned a piece of it, and his keycard blinked red and stayed red. I want to be clear with you about something regardless of who's telling which part of this. That business was not some side hustle for him. It was the only professional life he'd had for over a decade, the role he'd just been celebrated for retiring from, at the very party where he humiliated me. Operations manager, my employee, however comfortable that word had never felt to say out loud. Whatever that locked door meant to him in the moment, it wasn't a stranger keeping him out of somewhere he used to visit. It was proof that the whole life he'd assumed was half his had never carried his name at all. 77 missed calls by morning. I counted them once, scrolling past, and then I put the phone in a drawer. I didn't answer because there was nothing left to discuss that a phone call could fix. Some men only understand a thing once it's already happened to them, not while you're trying gently to explain it beforehand. I'd spent 30 years explaining things gently. I was done narrating my own life for an audience that never listened until the lights went out. What he did next, I only know because O'Dallas told me, her voice still shaking days later. Somewhere around 2 a.m, he showed up at her apartment, still in his suit from the party, and knocked until she let him in. He didn't tell her what he'd said to me, she said. He didn't need to. She'd heard it herself, laughed at it herself, same as her brother. Instead, according to her, he told a different story, that I'd overreacted, that changing locks and cutting off a man's job in the middle of the night, without a word, without a warning, was cruel, humiliating, that I'd taken something from him publicly, the same way he'd. She told me he never finished that sentence. He didn't have to. By her own account, she was already nodding before he stopped talking, already halfway to believing her father was the one who'd been wronged that night. Osgood caught himself before he finished that sentence, O'Dallas told me later. He said, the same way he'd, and then just stopped, shook his head like he was clearing static and started over with something safer. The same way she humiliated me, he said instead. In front of everyone. Nobody in that apartment asked him what he meant to say the first time. I think that's the part that still sits heaviest with me. Not that he caught himself, but that neither of my children thought to ask why he needed to catch himself at all. Thaddeus came over around 7 that morning, O'Dallas still in the clothes she'd worn to let her father in at 2. By the time I heard the full account, days later, I could picture the room clearly enough. Osgood at the kitchen island, coffee he probably wasn't drinking, telling his version to 2 grown children who loved him enough to want to believe him. He didn't deny what he'd said at the party. He couldn't. 200 people had heard it, my children included, laughing right along. So he didn't bother lying about the words. He built his whole defense around what came after. I said something stupid, I'm told he admitted. Something I regret. But your mother didn't come to me. Didn't yell at me. Didn't give me a chance to apologize. Nothing. She changed the locks on our house. She had me erased from the business I ran for 13 years. In one night. Was that necessary? For one bad sentence? One bad sentence. That's what he called it, not a pattern. Not 30 years of small erasures dressed up as compliments. One bad sentence, spoken to 200 witnesses, framed now as an isolated slip a reasonable woman should have absorbed gracefully. O'Dallas told me she felt her stomach turn hearing him say it that way. Not because she thought he was right. She was careful to tell me that part. but because it sounded so reasonable in his voice. That's always been his gift. Making the wrong thing sound like the measured thing, and the wronged person sound like the one who overreacted. Thaddeus didn't say much, she told me. He just kept looking at his coffee, jaw tight, the way he does when he's deciding which parent to be angry at and hasn't landed yet. By 9 that morning, my phone rang. I let it go twice before I picked up. Mom. Thaddeus's voice already had an edge to it, the kind that comes from a son who's spent a sleepless night building a case in his head. You need to fix this. Dad's locked out of his own house, his own job. Whatever he said, that doesn't justify what you did. I sat with that for a moment before I answered. Whatever he said. As if the words themselves were still a mystery to him. Still something, soft enough to gesture at instead of naming directly. Ask your father what he meant, I said, when he said it, not what he's saying now. What he meant then. Thaddeus went quiet on the other end, and for a second I thought I'd reached something in him. That's not an answer, he said finally. It's the only one I have right now, I told him. I already know what he meant. The question is whether you're ready to. I hung up before he could argue. Marceline showed up at my door 3 days after the party, still in her travel clothes, like she'd come straight from the airport without stopping to change. I hadn't called her. I want that clear. She heard about the speech from someone at the licensing board conference, someone who'd been at the party, and she got on the earliest flight back to Atlanta she could find. You should have called me, she said, standing in my doorway. I didn't want to make it real by saying it out loud to anyone yet, I told her. She stepped inside without being asked twice, which is how I knew this wasn't a comfort visit. Marceline doesn't rush, unless something in her has already decided the waiting is over. We sat in my living room and she didn't ease into it the way I expected. She just said it. Before you married him, Osgood asked me first. I heard the words. I understood every one of them individually. Put together, they didn't make sense to me for a moment. The way a sentence in a language you speak fluently can still trip you if you hear it in the wrong context. Asked you what? I said, though some part of me already knew. To be with him, before you two ever met properly. I said no. She wasn't looking away from me when she said it, which told me she'd rehearsed this moment enough times to survive making eye contact through it. I thought it ended there. I really did, Janet. For a long time I believed that. Believed what? That it ended there, she said again, quieter. It didn't. Not really. I think when he started seeing you, some part of it was about me still. Proving something. Being fine. I didn't know that then. Not clearly. Not in a way I could have said out loud to you. And once I did start to understand it, years in, you two already had a whole life together. And I told myself, the truth wouldn't rebuild anything. It would only take a wrecking ball to something that had already become real. So I made a habit of not looking at it too closely. The longer I kept the habit, the easier it got to convince myself silence was protecting you instead of just protecting me from having to be the one who said it. I sat very still. I've learned that stillness protects you in moments like that one. It buys you a few seconds before your face has to decide what it's going to do. And now, I said. Now he stood in a room full of people and said he wished he'd married me instead of you, Marceline said. And for the first time, her voice cracked slightly. That's not a man who let it go, Janet. That's 30 years of measuring you against something he never had. I couldn't sit on that anymore, and I couldn't sit on my own part in it either. Not after watching him say it out loud, in front of your children. I asked her the only question that mattered. Did he love me at all? Or was I always just the thing he built after I said no? She reached for my hand, and I let her take it, though I didn't grip back. I think somewhere in those 30 years, it became real, she said carefully. I think you were a good life he chose to keep choosing. But I don't think he ever stopped comparing it to a life he imagined with me. I think that comparison just got louder as he got older, and retirement gave it a microphone. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that, because I know what you might be expecting here. I sat with my oldest friend's hand around mine, and I felt something colder than grief settle into me instead. Something closer to arithmetic. 30 years, recalculated in real time. 30 years, I finally said, and I was never the one he saw. I wasn't in the room when Osgood sat across from his attorney, but Cassius called me that same afternoon with a summary so precise I could practically see it. He hired Marbury out of Buckhead, Cassius said. Good attorney, thorough. He'll fight for whatever's fightable, but I don't think there's much ground here to fight on. I asked what Osgood wanted. Everything, Cassius said simply. The house, the venue business, some claim on the LLC for the years he worked there. Sounds like Marbury spent the first part of the meeting actually looking into whether any of it was viable before he had to tell him where things stood. I could picture it clearly enough from what Cassius relayed and from what Odales told me afterward, once Osgood had already repeated the whole conversation to her. Looking for sympathy, he didn't get quite the way he expected. Marbury, apparently, had done his homework before he said anything final. I pulled the deed history on both properties, he told Osgood. I always do, before I tell a client what's realistic. The house was your wife's before the marriage, inherited, never retitled. Same with the commercial property. I looked for anything that might argue commingling, joint financing, marital funds used for major improvements, anything a judge could hang a claim on. I didn't find it. Her name, her mother's estate, no joint financing. That's about as clean as separate property gets, and I'd be doing you a disservice telling you otherwise. And the business? Osgood had asked. I looked at that closely too, Marbury said. She's sole member on the formation documents. Your work there matters, and I don't discount it. 13 years is 13 years. But legally, working somewhere doesn't establish ownership. I'd need your name on paperwork that was never filed to build anything there, and it isn't. I'm told Osgood went quiet for a while after that. Odales said he looked like a man doing math in his head and not liking any of the numbers. What do I actually have a claim to? He finally asked. Your pension, Marbury told him. That one's real, and it's yours to pursue fully. Earned during the marriage, so Georgia treats it as marital property. Janet's entitled to her portion the same way you'd be entitled to a share of anything she'd earned as a salaried employee during those years. The difference is, she wasn't salaried. She was the owner. That asymmetry is just the shape of how you two built things, and I can't argue it away. But your pension is real. It's yours to claim a share of, and I intend to make sure you get every bit you're owed there. Odales said her father didn't say anything for almost a full minute. 30 years, he finally said, and the only thing that's actually mine is a pension that won't cover the mortgage I don't even have access to anymore. I felt something when I heard that line repeated back to me. And it wasn't triumph, whatever you might expect. It was closer to recognizing an old ache finally being named correctly. 30 years of him assuming shared ownership over a life I'd built with intention, brick by brick, deed by deed. And in the end, the law simply confirmed what had always quietly been true. Marbury, apparently, wasn't finished advising him. There's one more avenue worth considering, he told Osgood, and Odales said his voice shifted into something more careful. It won't move a judge, but I'd be failing you if I didn't mention it. Family relationships sometimes accomplish outside of court what the law can't inside it. Your children have a real relationship with her. If they're willing to advocate for some kind of settlement, that carries weight, a ruling doesn't. Odalis said her father sat with that suggestion a long time before he answered. I think, he told his attorney slowly, it's time I had a real conversation with my kids. Odalis called me herself this time, and I could hear right away this wasn't going to be another conversation where she was carrying her father's words for him. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to just answer it straight. I told her I would. The wedding fund, the one Daddy always said he set aside for me when I was 16. I called the bank today because something felt off about a form I needed for the venue deposit. She paused long enough that I heard her breathe. Mom, my name's on that account. Yours is too. His isn't. I didn't say anything right away because I wanted her to get to the rest of it herself. I called Thaddeus after, she went on, asked him to check his business loan paperwork, the one from 3 years ago. The one Daddy always talked about, like he'd pulled favors to get him approved. Mom, the loan's collateralized against the commercial property. Your commercial property. His name's not on that paperwork either. No, I said quietly. It isn't. So all this time, she said, and her voice had gone very careful, very slow, like she was walking across ice she didn't trust. When he'd tell people he set us up, that he made sure we were taken care of. That was never really. She didn't finish the sentence. I let the silence sit there instead of rushing to fill it for her. Thaddeus called an hour later, and I could tell from the tone that Odalis had already talked to him before he dialed my number. I pulled the original loan documents, he said. No preamble. I don't know why I never actually read them before. I just believed what I was told. Another pause. It's your signature, Mom. Your collateral. He co-signed as a guarantor. That's it. That's all his name is on. I told him that was true. He talks about that loan like it's the reason I have a business, Thaddeus said. And for the first time, I heard something crack in his voice that wasn't anger. Exactly. It was closer to grief for a version of his father he'd been carrying around since he was 24 years old. Every family dinner, every toast, like it was his doing. He believed it was his doing, I said carefully, in his own way. He's always had a talent for standing near something good and calling it his. Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. Odalis said the wedding fund's the same story. It is. So it was never really him providing for us. It was you. It was always you. I didn't answer immediately because I wanted him to sit with the question long enough to really mean it when he asked it fully. Was it always you? He said again. Quieter this time, no accusation in it at all anymore. Just a son trying to recalculate 29 years of gratitude aimed in the wrong direction. I didn't ask Wendell to say anything. I want that clear before I tell you what happened, because I know how these things can look from the outside. Like I orchestrated a small war I only ever fought quietly, on paper, in rooms nobody else was in. Wendell called me himself about a week after the party, and the first thing he said was, Janet, I need you to know I haven't kept my mouth shut, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I told him he didn't owe me an apology either way. People have been asking me about that night, he said. You know how it is. Somebody heard a version, told somebody else, and by the third or fourth telling, it turns into something it wasn't. I got tired of hearing it wrong. So he'd started telling it right. Not embellished, not softened, just accurate. That Osgood stood up at his own retirement party and thanked a room full of people by name. And when he got to his wife of 30 years, he called her a loser and said he wished he'd married someone else, in front of her children, in front of 200 witnesses, and that Janet Caro hadn't cried, hadn't argued, hadn't given anyone the scene they might have expected. She'd simply stood up and walked out. Wendell told me Idella Fentress was the one who really carried it from there. I've known Idella 20 years, mostly from a distance. The kind of neighbor you wave to, trade holiday plates with, see at every block function without ever quite becoming close. She wasn't at the party, but she heard Wendell's account at a church function, and something about the plainness of it, the lack of drama in the telling, made it spread further than any exaggerated version might have. She kept saying the same thing to people, Wendell told me, that a man doesn't say something like that by accident. That 30 years is long enough to know exactly what you're saying and who's in the room when you say it. I didn't hear the rest of it all at once. It came to me the way most true things do, in pieces, over the weeks that followed. Wendell mentioned, almost in passing, that the Magnolia Club's membership committee had quietly opened Osgood's file when his dues renewal came up for its regular annual review, the same review every member goes through. Normally, it was a formality. This time, people on the committee found reasons to sit on it. A missing signature here, a request for updated references there, small procedural delays that added up to weeks of nothing happening. By the time the committee actually voted, nearly a month after the party, it wasn't really a decision anymore. It was a formality catching up to something that had already been decided quietly, one overlooked phone call at a time. Officially, his renewal lapsed during the review period, Wendell told me, once it was finally final. Nobody voted him out outright. Nobody had to. Reputation's a strange thing, Janet. It doesn't collapse all at once. It just quietly stops being extended to you, a little at a time, until one day, the paperwork simply reflects what everyone already stopped pretending. I sat with that for a moment after we hung up. I want to tell you, I felt something like satisfaction, but that's not quite honest. What I felt was closer to recognition. The same recognition I'd felt sitting in that ballroom watching him thank everyone but me. Consequences, real ones, rarely announce themselves loudly. They gather slowly, in small delays and quiet reviews, until a membership simply isn't renewed. A room no longer laughs as easily at his jokes, and a version of events finally matches what actually happened instead of the version he'd been telling himself. He was losing things now that had nothing to do with paperwork or property lines. Things I hadn't touched at all. Things that were unraveling simply because the truth had finally caught up to the room, one quiet delay at a time. Marceline called me on a Tuesday, and I could hear in her voice that she wasn't calling out of triumph. If anything, she sounded tired. "I want you to hear this from me before it reaches you some other way," she said. I asked her what happened. "Osgood filed an application," she said. "Small contracting venture, home renovation, subcontracting work, that kind of thing. It came across our board for review last week." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where all of this had started weeks earlier. "He's applied for licensing before," Marceline said. "Years ago, back when he first thought about branching out from the venue business. I wasn't the one who reviewed it. I made sure of that even then, since I knew him personally. But I did flag it to the reviewing officer as a complete, well-documented application from someone with a real operating history, which is genuinely what it was. That kind of flag just means it gets looked at promptly instead of sitting in a general pile. It wasn't special treatment. It was accurate information reaching the right desk a little faster. And this time I recused myself entirely in writing the moment I saw his name on the docket, she said. Given everything that's happened since, and given that he's now the estranged husband of my closest friend, there's no way I could touch this file, even to do something as small as flag it accurately, without it looking like exactly what it isn't. So I stepped back completely. It goes through ordinary review, the way it does for anyone the board doesn't have a personal connection to. I asked her what ordinary review looked like for someone in his position. Backlogged, she said. Badly. We've got a staffing shortage this year, applications stacking up faster than we can clear them. Realistically, a first-time small contractor application, no one flagging it, no connections at all, is looking at 10, 11 months before it's even fully reviewed. Could stretch past a year. I didn't say anything right away, turning that number over in my mind. He doesn't have a year, I finally said, not really to her, more to myself. No, Marceline agreed quietly. From what I understand, he doesn't. She told me what she knew of his financial picture from what had filtered back to her through mutual circles. The modest pension payout, nowhere near enough to sustain the life he'd assumed was permanently his. No access to the properties, no equity in the business. Savings dwindling faster than he'd planned for. The contracting license had been his plan, she said, his way of rebuilding something on his own, proving he didn't need anything of mine to stand on his own feet. And now that plan's stuck behind a queue, I said. A queue I have no ethical way of moving him through anymore, even if I wanted to, Marceline said. I want to be honest with you about that, in case some part of you is wondering whether I'm holding something back out of loyalty to you. I told her I wasn't wondering. I told her I understood completely. After we hung up, I thought about Osgood somewhere across town, refreshing an application status page that wouldn't change for months, watching a year stretch out in front of him with no income and no plan, sturdy enough to survive the wait. Not a punishment anyone had designed, not a door anyone had personally shut. Just a man discovering, one closed door at a time, how much of his life had only ever moved quickly because people who loved us both had been quietly, appropriately willing to vouch for him, and how ordinary, how unremarkable the process looked now that no one honestly could. O'Dallas showed up at my door on a Sunday afternoon without calling first, which was unlike her. She's always been the one who texts twice before knocking, out of some old habit of not wanting to intrude. She stood on my porch for a moment before I opened the door, like she was still deciding whether to turn around. "Can I come in?" she said, and it wasn't really a question. I stepped aside and let her in. We sat in the living room, the same room Marceline had sat in weeks earlier, and O'Dallas didn't waste time working up to it the way I half expected her to. "I laughed," she said, "at the party, when Daddy said that about you. I laughed, Mom, and I've been trying to understand why for weeks. And I don't have a good answer. I just know I owe you an apology that isn't wrapped up in some excuse about the moment or the mood in the room." I let her sit in that admission for a second before I responded. "Thank you for saying that plainly," I said. "Most people dress an apology up so much you can't find the actual apology inside it." "I don't want to dress it up," she said. "I've spent the last month finding out how much of my life was actually built by you, and it's made me look back at things I thought I understood and realize I didn't understand any of it. I laughed at you being called a loser. And it turns out I've been living off the work of the least lazy, least foolish person in this whole family." I felt something shift in my chest hearing her say it that way, but I didn't rush to soften the moment for her. "I'm not going to pretend that laugh didn't hurt," I told her. "It did. You're my daughter. I expected a great many things that night, but not that." "I know," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to just forgive that because I've finally figured it out." "No," I agreed. "I don't forgive it because you figured it out. I'd consider forgiving it if you're honest with me going forward, and if you put in real effort instead of expecting the relationship to reset itself just because you feel bad now. Feeling bad isn't the same as changing. She nodded, and I watched her actually absorb that instead of rushing to reassure me the way she might have a month earlier. "What do you want to understand?" I asked her. "About the marriage. You said you wanted to understand the real history. I won't hand you a version that protects anyone, including myself." She was quiet for a moment. "Everything. Start wherever you need to." I looked at my daughter, 31 years old, finally sitting across from me, ready to hear something honestly, instead of performing loyalty to whoever seemed most comfortable to believe. "There's something your Aunt Marceline told me," I said slowly, "a few weeks ago. Something about how your father and I actually began." Dallas went still. "What do you mean, how you began?" "I mean," I said, "your father asked to be with Marceline first, before me." She said no. I watched my daughter's face change in real time, watched 31 years of assumed history start quietly rearranging itself behind her eyes. Thaddeus asked me to meet him for lunch, said he wanted to talk somewhere neutral. I should have asked more questions before I agreed. I saw Osgood the moment I walked into the restaurant, sitting beside our son at a table meant for 3, and I understood immediately what this was. "You should have told me he'd be here," I said, still standing. "Sit down, Mom," Thaddeus said. Please, just hear us out." I sat, because leaving would have made a scene, and because some part of me was curious how far my son was willing to go for a man who'd put him in this position. Osgood didn't look at me right away. He looked at Thaddeus instead, like he was waiting for his son to run the meeting. "Dad and I have been talking," Thaddeus said, "about a way to settle this without dragging it through court for another year. Something that lets everyone walk away with dignity." "Dignity," I repeated. "A settlement," Thaddeus said. "Some portion of the business's value, paid out over time. Not the property, not ownership, just a fair number reflecting 13 years of work. In exchange, he drops any further claims, no drawn-out proceedings, and everyone can actually move forward." I looked at Osgood, who still hadn't met my eyes. "Is this the arrangement you want?" I asked him directly. "Or the arrangement you've asked our son to want for you?" He finally looked up. "Janet, I'm asking you to consider that I gave 13 years to that business." "You were paid a salary for 13 years, I said. "Every one of those years. This isn't a debt, Osgood. It's a job you held and were compensated for, same as anyone else on that payroll." "That's not fair," Thaddeus said, his voice rising slightly. "He's your husband. 30 years, Mom, and you're going to treat him like just another employee?" "He made that comparison himself," I said, keeping my voice level. "The night he stood up and thanked every stranger in that room by name before he got to me. I'm only agreeing with the terms he already set." Thaddeus flinched at that, but he didn't back down. "I'm asking you, as your son, to consider a settlement. Something. Anything. Watching him lose everything, publicly, permanently, that's not going to make any of this easier for our family." "It isn't meant to make things easier," I said. "It's meant to be honest. Those aren't always the same thing." "So you won't even consider it?" "No," I said, "I won't." Osgood's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might finally speak for himself instead of letting our son carry the weight of this conversation. He didn't. "I love you," Thaddeus said, quieter now. "And I love him. I don't know how to hold both of those at the same time if you won't meet us halfway on anything." I reached across the table and took my son's hand, the way I hadn't in years. "You don't have to choose who to love," I told him, "but you do have to choose whether you keep protecting him from what he did or let him finally stand in it." I stopped protecting him from his own consequences the night I left that party. I'm not starting again now. And I need you to ask yourself honestly why you think you should. The final hearing took less than 20 minutes. Cassius told me that's often how it goes when the real work has already happened everywhere else. In the filings, the disclosures, the months of back and forth between attorneys that never require a judge in the room until there's nothing left to decide but the last signatures. By the time we reached that hearing, we were nearly 5 months past the night of the party. 5 months of document requests, of Marbury quietly confirming what he already suspected about the properties, of the pension valuation going back and forth between accountants, of every avenue Osgood might have used getting closed one at a time, patiently, on paper, long before anyone ever stepped into a courtroom. What happened that final morning wasn't the whole divorce. It was just the last 20 minutes of it. The part where a judge reads into the record what both sides had already spent months agreeing was true. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. Cassius handled the finalization, and Marbury, Osgood's attorney, spent most of the hearing simply confirming what had already been settled weeks earlier on paper. The house and the commercial property remained mine, untouched, exactly as they'd always been. The business remained mine, sole member, formation documents unchanged since the day I filed them. Osgood's pension was split according to the marital portion earned during our years together, a number Cassius read to me afterward that was, in his words, modest enough that I don't think it changes his situation as much as he hoped. I felt something when Cassius told me it was finished. Not victory. Something quieter. The particular stillness of a door closing that had been slowly swinging shut for months. I heard about what happened after, the way I'd heard about so much of this now, through Thaddeus, who called me that evening sounding shaken in a way I hadn't heard from him before. He'd gone to check on his father afterward, he told me. Found him sitting alone in the apartment he'd been renting since the proceedings began. Papers from the hearing spread across the coffee table, untouched drink beside them. He wasn't angry, Thaddeus told me. That's what got me. I expected him to be angry. He was just still, like something had finally stopped moving in him. Thaddeus said he sat down across from his father, not sure what to say, and Osgood spoke first. You know, Osgood said, staring at the papers rather than at his son, I asked Marceline first, before your mother. Years ago, before any of this. Thaddeus said he went cold, hearing it, because he hadn't known that detail yet. O'Dallas hadn't told him, and Janet hadn't either. She said no, Osgood continued, and I told myself for 30 years that it didn't matter, that I loved your mother completely, that what came before her didn't touch what came after. I think some part of me always knew that wasn't entirely true. Dad, Thaddeus started. I knew, Osgood said, cutting him off gently, still not looking up. Somewhere in me, I always knew I started that marriage, measuring it against something I didn't get to have. I told myself it faded. It didn't fade, Thaddeus. It just got quiet enough that I could ignore it for 3 decades, until retirement gave me too much silence to keep ignoring it in. Thaddeus told me he didn't know what to say to that. He just sat with his father in that quiet apartment, surrounded by papers confirming exactly how much Osgood had lost, and listened to him finally say out loud what apparently he'd never said to anyone in 30 years of marriage. I built a whole life next to your mother, Osgood said quietly, and some part of me never stopped comparing it to a life I never actually had a right to. That's not her failure, Thaddeus. That was never her failure. It was mine, and I let it cost me everything before I ever said it honestly to a single living soul. Thaddeus told me he left his father's apartment that night and sat in his car in the parking lot for almost half an hour before he could make himself drive home. Thaddeus came to my house 2 days after that night in his father's apartment, and I could see something had settled differently in his face, a kind of tiredness that wasn't about sleep. I need to tell you what he said to me, he said before he'd even sat down. I told him to take his time. He repeated it slowly, carefully, like he was still testing the weight of each sentence as it left his mouth. The admission about Marceline. The 30 years of quiet comparison. His father sitting alone with divorce papers spread across a coffee table, finally saying out loud what he'd apparently never said to another living soul. He said it wasn't your failure, Thaddeus told me. That it was never your failure. That he let something he never had a right to cost him everything. And he let it happen for 30 years without ever being honest about it. Not with you, not with himself. I sat with that for a moment before responding. That's the most honest thing your father has said in this entire situation, I told him. I kept defending him, Thaddeus said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word defending. I sat across from you at that restaurant and asked you to treat him with dignity, like he'd earned some kind of grace he hadn't actually earned. I did that because I couldn't accept that the version of him I grew up with wasn't entirely real. He wasn't a lie, Thaddeus, I said carefully. He loved you. He loved your sister. Some of what you grew up with was real. But real and complete aren't the same thing. And I think that's what you're finally sitting with. I laughed at that party, Thaddeus said quietly. I laughed at you being called a loser. And some part of me justified it because I told myself Dad wouldn't say something like that without reason, without you doing something to deserve it. I built a whole excuse for him before I even had the facts. You did, I agreed. You're not the only one who did that. But you're the one sitting here now, admitting it out loud instead of building a new excuse to replace the old one. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the last piece of resistance finally settling into place. I don't know how to make up for the last few months, he said. The settlement I asked you to consider. The way I treated this like it was your job to protect his comfort at the cost of your own dignity. You don't make up for it in one conversation, I told him. You make up for it the same way I built everything you've been discovering these past weeks. Slowly, consistently, without expecting credit for showing up. He nodded, and I could see him turning something over before he spoke again. The business, he said. I know it's yours. Completely. Yours. And I'm not asking for ownership or a title I haven't earned. But I'd like to help rebuild what got shaken this year, if you'll let me. Not because I feel guilty. Because I actually want to understand what you built, properly this time, instead of standing near it and assuming I already did. I studied my son's face, looking for the old performance in it, the easy charm his father had always worn so effortlessly. I didn't find it. What I found instead looked like something closer to respect. 3 months after the divorce finalized, I stood in the venue's back office watching Thaddeus argue with a vendor over a contract clause, and I felt something in my chest I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Not relief, exactly. Something closer to pride. He'd started small, exactly the way I wanted him to. No title handed to him out of guilt or convenience. He shadowed our events coordinator for the first month, learned the vendor relationships from the ground up, asked more questions than any employee I'd ever hired. Odalis came in 2 days a week after her regular job, handling marketing, and I watched her push back on a branding decision I'd made without flinching, the way you push back on something only when you actually understand it well enough to disagree. We were expanding into a second venue space by spring, something I'd been quietly planning for over a year before any of this happened. The difference now was that my children were building it with me instead of assuming they already had a stake in it. I was reviewing floor plans at my kitchen table one evening when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a familiar area code. Janet! Osgood's voice, careful, like he'd rehearsed the opening. Please don't hang up. I didn't hang up. I also didn't say anything. which I've learned unsettles people more than silence ever should. I had Marbury take one more look at the pension split, he said. See if there was anything left to revisit. He told me the window closed months ago, and even if it hadn't, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. I wanted you to hear that from me before you heard it from him. All right, I said simply. That's not actually why I called, he admitted, and something in his voice shifted, less rehearsed now. I've had a lot of time to sit with everything. What I said, what it cost. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I keep thinking about 30 years, Janet. And I keep wondering if there's any version of this where we… No, I said, gently, before he could finish shaping the question. There isn't. He was quiet for a moment. I understand. I don't think you do entirely, I told him, but I think you're closer to understanding than you were 3 months ago, and that's something. I hope you build whatever's next for you, honestly. I mean that. But it won't be built next to me. All right, he said, and I heard something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. The particular relief of a question finally being answered instead of left open to wonder about. I hung up and sat there for a moment with the floor plans still spread across my table, half expecting the conversation to have shaken something loose in me. It hadn't. I felt steady. The way you feel stepping off a boat onto solid ground you'd forgotten you missed. Thaddeus knocked on my doorframe an hour later, still in his work clothes, holding 2 folders. Vendor's ready to sign, he said. Wanted you to look it over first, though, before I finalize anything. I looked at my son, asking permission not out of fear, but out of respect for a process he was finally learning to honor. Let's look at it together, I said, and made room for him at the table. The ballroom was smaller this time, maybe 80 people instead of 200, but the room felt fuller than the one I'd walked out of a year earlier. We were celebrating the second venue's opening, string lights strung across a courtyard Odalis had designed herself, down to the last detail. Thaddeus stood near the entrance greeting vendors by name, comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with performance anymore. I watched him from across the room and thought about the young man who'd once asked me to extend his father grace he hadn't earned, and felt something settle peacefully in my chest at how far he'd come since then. Cassius found me near the bar, champagne in hand, and raised his glass slightly. You built this twice now, he said, once quietly, once out loud. I only ever built it once, I told him. This time, I just let people watch me do it. Marceline arrived a little after 8, still recognizable across a room the way she'd always been, the kind of presence people notice without meaning to. She hugged Odalis first, then made her way to me. You did good, she said simply, looking around the courtyard. We did good, I corrected her, and she smiled at that, understanding exactly what I meant. I saw Osgood only once that night, and only because Wendell mentioned it to me quietly near the dessert table. He'd driven past, apparently, slowed down along the street outside, looked at the lights and the courtyard full of people who used to be his audience, and kept driving. He didn't come in. I don't think he could have, even if some part of him wanted to. I heard from Thaddeus, weeks later, that his father had taken a job managing inventory for a mid-sized hardware chain outside the city. Steady work. Nothing that required a license or a board's approval. Nothing that asked anyone to extend him goodwill he hadn't earned yet. Thaddeus said his father seemed smaller in the telling of it, not cruelly so, just quieter, the way a man gets when the applause finally, permanently, stops. I didn't feel triumph hearing that. I want to be honest with you about that, the same way I've tried to be honest with you through all of this. I felt something closer to peace, not because he suffered, but because the truth of our 30 years had finally settled into its rightful shape, and I no longer had to carry the weight of pretending otherwise. Odalis found me near the end of the night, slightly out of breath from directing the cleanup crew, and sat beside me for a moment without saying anything. "You okay, Mom?" she finally asked. "I'm better than okay," I told her, and meant it completely. I looked out over that courtyard, my daughter's design, my son's steady hands managing every detail, my oldest friend laughing near the entrance, a life I'd built quietly for 30 years, finally standing in full view of everyone who once doubted it existed at all. Osgood spent 30 years believing he already had it all. He just forgot that all of it was mine to begin with.